Linda Ronstadt, the legendary American voice, once crossed the greatest stages, where audiences needed only a single line to rise in applause. It was that voice that carried her to the summit, only for her body to later become the boundary she had to confront. Today, Linda still hears the melodies with striking clarity in her mind, still remembers every interval and every breath. But her body no longer has the strength to sing them aloud. What is most devastating is not the silence itself, but the truth that the music is still alive within her. It simply no longer has a path to come out. The story begins in the years when Linda left Arizona for Los Angeles, when the city was still an open crossroads of music and long nights on stage. Between the Troubadours stage and late conversations with artist friends who would later become the Eagles, her way of working took shape naturally. Focused, reserved, never in a hurry to define herself. Los Angeles was radiant, yet full of pressure. As the public gradually came to see an icon, Linda learned how to stay clear-headed under the lights, close enough to work with seriousness, distant enough that fame would not dictate the rhythm of her life. That journey was not forged by a single moment, but by a series of quiet, sustained, and consistent choices. Linda Ronstadt was born in 1946 in Tucson, Arizona, into a family with deep roots in the Sonoran borderlands, a place where boundaries between cultures were not experienced as divisions, but as layers naturally overlapping one another. That desert region, with its harsh climate, towns clinging to the border, and generations of migration memory, shaped a way of life in which music, language, and family stories blended into the rhythm of everyday existence. Music functioned as memory, as a living language, and as part of a shared community identity. Her father, of Mexican-German heritage, grew up with ranchera songs, mariachi, and Mexican folk music tied closely to family life and ritual. These melodies surfaced at gatherings, religious holidays, and quiet evenings together, not as performances, but as the common pulse of family and community. Her mother, with a European background, opened a different musical world. Gilbert and Sullivan, Broadway, American folk songs. Music from the radio, from records, from singing together at home. All of it flowed into daily life without the need for boundaries or labels. These two currents of influence coexisted side by side in everyday life without needing to be named or categorized. Linda did not approach music through theory or classification, but by listening a great deal and listening closely, a habit that would stay with her for life. Growing up bilingual and bicultural, music came to Linda even before the idea of a career, as a familiar territory that required no justification. As she entered early adulthood, Linda Ronstadt still had no clear picture of the road ahead. She attended the University of Arizona briefly, at a time when options remained open and decisions had not yet hardened into pressure. Music was not yet the central axis of her working life, but neither was it separate from the ordinary days. Linda sang in private moments, among friends, at small gatherings, spaces that demanded neither roles nor proof. Singing happened naturally, unconnected to plans or strategies. The songs she chose were mostly familiar melodies from family life and childhood memory, music close enough that it did not require validation. At this stage, music retained its original place, a means of expressing feeling, not yet a promise of the future, and certainly not a commitment to the public or the marketplace. In that suspended state, Linda gradually sensed the distance between being able to sing and being ready for her voice to step beyond private spaces. That awareness quietly shaped how she would later approach music, slowly, cautiously, always questioning why she was singing at all. Those years did not produce a dramatic turning point, but rather resembled a discrete period of preparation, during which inner awareness grew before becoming choice. Years later, Linda once said that she truly trusted only what she had heard before the age of 10. The remark reflects the way she matured. Music did not arise from a drive to conquer, but from familiarity and a sense of belonging. This was not nostalgia, but an inner standard, one in which authenticity always outweighed adaptability to trends. In 1964, at the age of 18, Linda decided to leave the University of Arizona, a decision not born of youthful impulsiveness, but of an increasingly clear sense that the classroom was not where her voice could fully live. Time spent in lectures began to feel subtly out of sync, as her mind kept drifting toward impromptu singing, moments when she felt most fully herself. That quiet distance soon compelled Linda to make a concrete choice, not in search of success, but to place her voice in an environment wide enough to test it. After that decision, Linda left Tucson and moved to Los Angeles with Bob Kimmel, carrying not a clear plan, but a sense that the road ahead would only reveal itself once she placed herself in a different space. Small cafes and clubs in West Hollywood became familiar ground. Linda sang folk songs, country tunes, and ballads she had carried with her from Tucson, standing close to the audience, with no clear boundary between stage and listener. Here, audiences did not seek perfection, but they were not easily persuaded either. Each night was a test. Could that voice stand on its own, once separated from the context of family and memory? It was in these cramped rooms that Linda began to feel a new kind of pressure. Not the pressure of fame, but the pressure of having to prove the value of her voice to strangers. By late 1964, Linda was appearing regularly at the Troubadour, not as a featured artist, but as a familiar presence at Hoot Nights, where young musicians took turns stepping on stage to try themselves out before an audience. In that small, crowded space thick with conversation and cigarette smoke, Linda did not seek attention. She stayed slightly to the side, observing more than performing, listening to see where she might belong within Los Angeles's shifting musical life. There, she reconnected with Bob Kimmel, who had left Tucson before her, and met Kenny Edwards, a versatile young musician inclined toward rock and a more modern group structure. The three began singing together, not from an ambition to form a band, but from a very practical need. More chances to be on stage, more opportunities to hear how their voices sounded alongside others. Early performances were scattered, centered on familiar folk material, occasionally punctuated by small experiments in harmony. By 1965, as performing became more regular, the group formally took the name the Stone Poneys, a name chosen to meet the practical demands of booking and promotion, more a marker of identity than an artistic manifesto. In 1966, the Stone Poneys entered Capitol Records studio, and those first recordings captured Linda in a transitional state. Her voice had clearly matured in emotional depth and inner strength, yet it was still framed within a cautious folk rock setting, as if balancing her personal sensibility against the collective direction of the group. The debut album, The Stone Poneys, emerged from those sessions, not as an artistic declaration, but as the outcome of a process of trying to stand securely within the marketplace. The album's moderate reception did little to conceal a growing sense that each member was listening toward a different musical horizon and that the easy consensus that once existed was beginning to thin. Outside the studio, the Troubadour remained the place everyone returned to night after night. In its smoke-filled room, layered with overlapping guitars, young faces such as J.D. Souther, Jackson Browne, Glenn Frey, Don Henley, and Bernie Leadon appeared, each searching for a foothold. They sang together, traded places on stage, introduced one another to bands missing a member. Connections formed naturally, the way a small community quietly supports itself in order to survive. Within a rock environment where competition and hierarchy were always present, professional attention gradually began to focus on Linda's voice, naturally, but inevitably. That attention brought opportunity while also revealing pre-existing molds reserved for a female singer, where the voice was treated more as a marketable resource than as a self-contained aesthetic world. As the Stone Poneys began to be mentioned more often beyond the troubadour, everything looked like a beginning. Performances became more regular, the studio no longer felt foreign, and Linda's voice, once heard in crowded hoot nights, was now placed before the microphone under the careful scrutiny of industry professionals. Yet inside that sense of moving upward, there was no clear exhilaration. The group still functioned as a temporary collective, held together by the need to play music rather than a shared vision. Linda remained in the familiar lineup, but her sense of position had shifted, not by intent, but because her voice was becoming increasingly difficult to dissolve into the whole. Everything changed when Different Drum entered the studio in 1967. The song was not written for Linda, nor conceived as a statement. It arrived as an unfamiliar melody carrying a very different spirit, restrained, light, and deeply aware of personal boundaries. When Linda sang Different Drum, there was no technical fireworks, no moment of display. There was only a voice moving at its own pace, keeping its own time, refusing to follow the beat someone else was setting. The song quickly reached radio airplay, climbed the charts, and became the recording most associated with the Stone Poneys. But that reception carried a paradox. The public heard a voice, not a group. And the industry began to see the same thing. The Stone Poneys continued to perform, to record, to exist as a unit. Yet in shared working moments, a quiet feeling emerged, that the common rhythm holding everyone together was becoming harder to sustain. No one said it aloud. There were no arguments, only the sense that the shared tempo was slowing, while another rhythm, more solitary, was beginning to form. The success of Different Drum did not feel like victory to Linda. It made her more aware of something she had long avoided, that her voice was being named more clearly with each passing moment, even as she tried to maintain a safe distance. And alongside that, attention came a quiet anxiety. Whether, once she no longer stood within the group formation, there would still be a place for her to take shelter. The dissolution of the Stone Poneys did not happen in a single, clearly defined moment. It unfolded as a slow process of drifting apart. The ending arrived without ceremony or explanation. Performance schedules gradually thinned, shared plans were left suspended, and at a certain point, no one spoke anymore about continuing, as if everyone had quietly accepted that the road they were traveling together had reached its limit. By late 1968, the name The Stone Poneys still existed on paper, but on stage, the band was no longer present in the way it once had been. When that chapter closed, Linda Ronstadt entered an entirely different phase. No longer shielded by the protective ring of a collective, no longer sharing position or responsibility. For the first time, her voice stood fully at the center, without a refuge, without harmonies behind it, as support. What remained was a quiet test. In a fiercely competitive musical world, could she, on her own, carve out a path for her voice? In that sense, Different Drum was more than a hit. It was the first moment Linda was forced to listen to her own tempo, and to realize that from here on, she would have to keep moving without a formation to hide behind. No noise, no drama, just a quiet farewell that opened onto a more solitary journey, clearer in outline and far more fragile. Her first solo album took shape in a state very different from what is usually called a beginning. Hand-sewn, Homegrown did not emerge from a sense of readiness or from a carefully prepared decision, but from the inertia of having to keep going once the Stone Poneys were no longer a structure to lean on. Capitol Records was still open. The studio was still there. But this time, everything unfolded in a more exposed space. One without a collective to share hesitation, without the cover of a group identity. Recording sessions were scheduled sporadically, lacking urgency, yet also devoid of any spirit of assertion. The track list reflected that condition clearly. Folk, country, and pop rock appeared side by side without a single aesthetic axis. Some songs carried the rustic, unadorned quality of Tucson memories. Others leaned toward the familiar radio structures of the late 1960s. The voice stood clearly at the center, but the surrounding sound world was still feeling for its shape. Even in production, the album bore the marks of trying to place the voice in multiple environments. There was no attempt to define an image, no promotional message built as a coherent narrative. Hand-sewn. Homegrown felt more like a notebook than a declaration. Recording the voice as it tested itself in different contexts to see where it might be able to remain for more than a fleeting moment. Released in 1969, the album passed quietly through the marketplace. It was not rejected, but neither did it generate enough pull to hold public attention. There was no signature song, no notable chart position. In an American music landscape then leaning heavily toward hard-edged rock and explicit generational statements, the album was quickly overshadowed. Critical responses acknowledged the quality of the voice, but stopped there, as if everyone were waiting for something that had not yet appeared. Professional life gradually shifted onto long roads, where cities were no longer remembered for distinct moments, but for the length of highway stretches and hotel rooms so similar they blurred together. Each stop allowed only one night on stage before packing up and moving on again. And within that repetitive motion, the idea of returning slowly slipped out of daily life, leaving behind a suspended feeling between staying and departing. In those performance spaces, music had to find its own way. Some nights the audience was so quiet that breathing became audible. Other nights sound had to thread its way through barroom chatter. There was no aura to provide cover, no collective to lean on, only the moment between the singer and the ears in front of her, fragile, yet strong enough to hold the night in place. During those same years came consecutive tours with a very young backing band: Glenn Frey, Don Henley, Bernie Leadon, Randy Meisner. They moved together from night to night, setting up, tearing down, getting back on the road before any place could become familiar. There were no words of encouragement, no stories to cling to, only the schedule, the clock, and the sound that had to remain intact from one night to the next. Life on tour operated by a quiet discipline. Everything happened on time, according to structure. Just enough. No one tried to stretch their moment. Fatigue was not allowed to disrupt the shared tempo. These rules did not need to be spoken. They lived in how everyone worked, in the steadiness of each performance. Music here was not a space for displaying personality, but a continuous rhythm of labor, where each person had to hold their part so the show could pass intact. When the tour ended, there were no promises or commitments. Each person turned in a direction when it felt right. Those years were not preserved as collective memory, nor named as a distinct phase. They simply receded, making room for the days that followed, where new schedules opened, other rehearsals began, and the voice continued stepping into spaces not yet familiar. And within all that motion, standing on stage slowly took on a different meaning. No shared position, no supporting structure, just each night unfolding on its own terms, with the band behind, the audience in front, and the voice having to find a way to exist within a space that was widening little by little. From the mid-1970s onward, Linda Ronstadt's path gradually shifted onto a different trajectory, not loudly, but steadily and irreversibly. Recording sessions took place in an atmosphere of focus and restraint, at a moment when her voice had already been affirmed. Yet her aesthetic direction was still being quietly shaped through each song choice, each decision made in the studio. Then, in 1974, Heart Like a Wheel appeared, as the natural milestone toward which that journey had been moving. As country rock began to move from the margins toward the center of mainstream culture, Heart Like a Wheel was constructed as an open space for Linda Ronstadt's voice, rather than an attempt to lock it into a single rock identity. Country, pop, folk, and soul were placed side by side, not in the spirit of experimentation, but through deliberate arrangement, reflecting aesthetic layers that had long existed within her voice. You're No Good, the album's opening track, was handled with restraint and firm pacing, avoiding technical showmanship so that the shape of the voice itself became the guiding axis. Released at the end of 1974, the song quickly rose to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, carrying the album straight into the heart of the mainstream market. Success arrived quickly and unmistakably. Heart Like a Wheel reached #1 on the Billboard album chart and sold more than 2 million copies in the United States, a rare achievement for a female rock artist at the time. That success was formally affirmed with the 1975 Grammy Award for Best Pop Vocal Performance, Female, the first time Linda Ronstadt's name was placed squarely at the center of the major award system. From that point on, everything moved at a different speed. The studio became a place she had to return to regularly, no longer a space for exploration, but an obligatory destination. Hasten Down the Wind was recorded and released in 1976 under those conditions. Success continued, the album reached the top 3 on the Billboard 200, and her voice was again honored with a Grammy in 1977 in the same category. Yet behind the numbers, a sense of accumulated fatigue began to surface. Each new recording had to be not only good, but also sustain the image the public had come to expect. A few years later, Linda Ronstadt's commercial trajectory was pushed to an even higher level with Simple Dreams. Released in 1977, the album reached #1 on the Billboard 200 and quickly achieved multi-million sales. Songs like Blue Bayou, It's So Easy, and Poor, Poor, Pitiful Me dominated radio airwaves, weaving themselves into everyday listening as something familiar and constant. At this stage, her career seemed to propel itself forward. Each new release was automatically placed at the center of attention, and every appearance carried the weight of expectations to maintain the scale the audience and the market had grown accustomed to. Soon after, living in the USA reinforced that position even more clearly. The album again reached #1 on the Billboard 200. The accompanying tour sold out widely, and sales reached multi-platinum levels. By this point, Linda Ronstadt was recognized by both the media and the industry as the best-selling female rock artist in the United States, a status established through charts, sales figures, and awards, not merely public sentiment. When all external measures had become unmistakably clear, internal questions began to sound more distinctly. The repetitive cycle of recording on fixed schedules, the obligation to maintain a stable public image, and the growing distance between the stage lights and private life turned each new album into not just a musical project, but a psychological test. Success followed success, yet the gap between this reality and the original, unpressured connection to family music and informal singing nights became increasingly difficult to ignore. There was no public crisis, no declaration of withdrawal, only a quiet state in which success no longer functioned solely as affirmation, but began to raise a silent question, was remaining firmly at the peak, slowly pulling that voice farther away from the place where it had first begun. In 1980, Linda Ronstadt stepped onto the Broadway stage in The Pirates of Penzance, a performance environment entirely different from anything she had previously known. No enclosed studio, everything unfolded directly before an audience. Voice, breath, physical stamina, and discipline had to be maintained night after night. The role of Mabel demanded a high range, rapid passages, and near absolute precision in every performance. There was no room to save the voice or adjust emotion according to mood. Each night, the voice had to enter at exactly the right moment, pitch, and placement. Within a system where orchestra, cast, and lighting functioned like a precisely programmed machine. For Linda, this was the first time she had to place her voice inside a structure that did not allow the instinctive flexibility of pop rock performance. Rehearsals and performances unfolded under rigorous intensity. Fixed schedules, a high number of shows per week, and the requirement to maintain consistent form over an extended period. There was no studio to edit mistakes, no second take. Each night's performance was a recording that could not be erased. In that environment, Linda's voice was tested in a completely different way, not to impress, but to endure within a classical form that had existed for more than a century. The success of the production exceeded expectations. The Pirates of Penzance became a theatrical phenomenon, and Linda received a Tony Award nomination for her role, a rare milestone for an artist whose career began in pop rock. That recognition did not come from sales figures or media saturation, but from the fact that her voice met the most exacting standards of the Broadway stage. Almost in parallel with her Broadway experience, Linda Ronstadt entered a defining collaboration with Nelson Riddle, the conductor who had shaped the sound of the Great American Songbook era through recordings with Frank Sinatra, Nat King Cole, and Ella Fitzgerald. This meeting did not arise from a desire to experiment, but from a very specific need: to place the voice within a musical structure where emotion had to be held to a minimum and every movement was governed by orchestration. The album, What's New, released in 1983, marked their first collaboration. The large orchestra retained Riddle's classical spirit, slow tempos, wide spaces, and room enough for each vocal line to exist without being pushed in intensity. Linda did not try to modernize songs familiar to an earlier generation, nor did she bring pop rock habits of emphasis into the performances. The voice was placed lower and softer, set back behind the orchestra, a choice that demanded absolute control and complete trust in the structure of the songs. The album sold well, received strong critical praise, and, more importantly, demonstrated that audiences were still willing to listen to older songs when they were presented with respect for their original form. That reception led to two further releases, Lush Life, 1984, and For Sentimental Reasons, 1986, completing a trilogy recorded and produced in the same restrained spirit. Together, these albums marked a rare detour, a voice stepping away from the peak of commercial success to stand within the American musical canon through discipline, restraint, and respect for form, without redefining it, flattening it, or chasing the market's pace. From that trajectory, Canciones de mi Padre emerged in 1987. Recorded entirely in Spanish with a traditional mariachi orchestra, the album made no concessions to pop radio and no attempt to blend itself into something more accessible for the Anglo market. Songs bound to family memory and to the cultural borderlands where she grew up were brought into the studio with the same seriousness, not as an experiment, but as an act of preservation. Before its release, the project was viewed with caution. For the industry, it was a difficult move to explain. Too personal, too far from the market's center, and almost completely detached from the image of a pop star at the height of commercial success. There was no familiar formula to rely on, and no clear precedent for an album like this. Reality unfolded differently. Canciones de mi Padre quickly exceeded all expectations, becoming the best-selling Spanish-language album in U.S. history at the time. Yet, its weight did not rest solely in numbers. For the Latin community, it was received as a rare moment in which traditional music was placed at the center of American cultural life without explanation or compromise. Family memory, language, and musical structure were kept intact, standing on their own through presence alone. Linda Ronstadt rarely appeared as a political spokesperson, but when necessary, she did not avoid speaking out, especially on issues directly tied to identity and language. Bringing Spanish and mariachi music onto the most prestigious stages did not come with slogans or declarations. It happened quietly, with the same discipline and seriousness she brought to every musical project. In a period when debates over immigration and language were growing increasingly heated, that choice became an answer in itself. Language does not need to be translated to be respected, and identity does not need permission to exist. While her artistic path continued to open into new directions, Linda Ronstadt's private life moved at a different pace, discreet and shaped far less by the familiar milestones of public life. There was no long-term marriage placed at the center, no traditional family structure running parallel to her career. Romantic relationships appeared and ended amid dense work, schedules, consecutive tours, and a life constantly in motion. The absence of marriage came without declarations or stated positions. Linda did not turn her private life into a narrative that needed explanation. It existed alongside her work, quietly and within self-imposed boundaries. In those years, the focus remained on the studio, the stage, and the projects that followed, spaces where professional discipline and expressive quality consistently came before any form of personal disclosure. Entering the 1990s, a concrete and decisive change appeared in her personal life. In 1990, Linda Ronstadt adopted a daughter, and 4 years later, in 1994, she adopted a son. This decision was not announced as a media event, nor framed within any narrative about balancing career and family. It unfolded quietly, consistent with the way she had always handled important personal choices. Motherhood did not trigger a sudden withdrawal from music, but it began to noticeably shape how Linda organized daily life. Work schedules were adjusted, projects were weighed more carefully in terms of time and intensity. Long tours became less frequent. There were no declarations of sacrifice, no emphasis on a change of role, only the arrival of a new responsibility that naturally slowed the rhythm of life. In the rare interviews where she spoke about family, Linda Ronstadt described motherhood as part of a private life, separate from her image as an artist. Not as compensation, and not as an alternative to marriage. It existed as a new reality, concrete, enduring, and not in need of symbolic interpretation. Within that new rhythm, there were no clear signs foretelling what was to come. Only a sense that every movement, from work to everyday life, was beginning to be carried out with greater caution. By the late 2000s, the change did not arrive as a rupture. It slipped into Linda Ronstadt's professional life through signs that were small yet impossible to ignore. Familiar pitches suddenly became harder to hold. Transitions that once unfolded naturally now demanded excessive concentration. And the feeling of standing in the right place within the music grew increasingly fragile. For an ordinary singer, this might have been a phase requiring rest. For Linda Ronstadt, who had built her entire inner life around control of the voice, it was a direct intrusion into identity itself. The voice was not merely a tool of expression. It was the way Linda existed in the world. For decades, she did not need to explain who she was. She only needed to sing. When that ability began to slip beyond her control, the familiar ground where she had once stood securely no longer felt safe. The music still ran perfectly in her mind. Every interval, every breath, every point of landing. But when she opened her mouth, the path no longer led outward. In the studio, Linda began stopping more often between phrases. There were passages she asked to record again and then again, not because the pitch was technically wrong, but because what she heard in the headphones did not match what she had just sung. She knew precisely where she wanted a phrase to go, where the breath should fall, where the note should land, how long the silence should be held. But when she sang, the voice no longer traveled in that direction. Rehearsals stretched longer than usual, not to find ways to impress, but to recheck every small movement, entering a fraction earlier, holding breath slightly longer, lowering expectations in passages that had once felt effortless. At times, she stopped midway, said nothing, and turned back to the sheet music as if searching for an error that must have been written incorrectly. There were no signs that practice would restore everything to its former place. Studio technology offered little help, because the problem was not the recorded sound, but the distance between what was heard internally and what emerged aloud. Linda still recognized her voice. It simply no longer stood where it was being called to stand. These changes did not occur before an audience. They unfolded in private spaces, where no one else could hear the discrepancy except the singer herself. And precisely because of that, they were harder to explain, harder to accept. Each time, the voice failed to respond as before. She did not react with panic or complaint. She fell silent, took note, and kept working, as if hoping familiarity might return if she were patient enough. When Linda announced that she would stop performing in 2011, there was no accompanying ritual of closure, no farewell tour, no final stage, no song designated as the last one. In American public life, where an artist's departure is often staged as a sequence of preservable images, that choice left a void not easily filled. Fans were given no final moment to hold on to, no clear end point at which to place their emotions. Everything ended with a brief statement, followed by silence. That absence forced memory to operate on its own terms. Old recordings were revisited not as framed nostalgia, but as sounds no longer belonging to the present. The silence did not make noise. It simply lasted, long enough to reveal something rarely confronted directly, that some losses do not need to be announced, yet are unmistakably present once one realizes that voice will never again be heard rising within the spaces of everyday life. The silence persisted without explanation. There was no story retold in neat sequences of cause and effect. Only the absence of the voice from the places where it had once appeared most naturally. For a long time, even Linda did not name what was happening. The changes were slow, dispersed, difficult to grasp, enough to be felt, but not yet clear enough to form a conclusion. Only years later, when the symptoms extended beyond the voice to movement and physical coordination, were medical examinations carried out more systematically. The initial diagnosis pointed toward Parkinson's disease, a familiar and easily named possibility in public discourse. But continued observation revised that assessment, leading to a different conclusion: progressive supranuclear palsy, a rare neurological disorder with a faster progression. Once the diagnosis was confirmed, Linda did not change the path she had already chosen. There was no plan to return, no attempt to see how much was left by testing the voice again. The voice had left the life of performance, and she did not try to summon it back as a test of will. There were no comeback rehearsals, no demo recordings to try it out. Such meetings were never placed on the table, as if from the beginning she had known they would distort what she had once protected. The media quickly waited for a familiar narrative, a story of struggle, a symbol of resilience, a return framed as spiritual affirmation. Linda did not step into that mold. She did not perform again, nor did she cast herself as a representative of collective hope or endurance. Her body was not turned into a new stage. Illness did not become a recurring subject to be narrated. Any public appearances, if they occurred at all, were tightly limited, centered on books, memory, or what she could still express through language when music was no longer a viable path. Invitations continued to arrive, along with the familiar questions waiting to be filled. One appearance, one explanation, one way to neatly close the silence. Linda did not follow that rhythm. She did not replace the voice with another image, nor did she construct her absence into a story. The silence was left intact, not prolonged to attract attention, nor cut short to reassure anyone. There was no return, no speech. Only the fact that the voice was no longer where it had once belonged, and nothing else was placed in that space. In the years that followed, Linda continued living at a different pace, reading, writing, remembering, and speaking when necessary. Her memoir emerged as the remaining form of voice, not to compensate for loss, but to place it where it belonged in memory. There was no climax, no final victory. Only a choice held consistently to the end. When she could no longer sing with her own voice, she refused to sing in its place through any other image. The memoir Simple Dreams, published in 2013, was not constructed as an explanation nor as an attempt to reclaim position within public memory. It moved against the familiar storytelling habits of celebrity culture. It did not arrange life into a sequence of triumphs and defeats, nor reconstruct moments of glory to reaffirm established value. The pages opened from a deeper place, from family, from the borderlands, from songs heard before she ever knew she would become a singer, and from the choices that had quietly shaped how she stood within. Music for decades. Within it, the voice no longer appeared as a center to be defended or mourned. It stepped back, making room for memory, context, and the people who had passed through her professional life. Music was recounted as a series of relationships, with family, with community, with language and history, rather than as a personal possession that had been lost. Writing did not aim to fill the silence, but to give it structure, origin, and a clear place within inner life. Beyond the pages, life narrowed according to the body's very real limits. Linda did not seek to reappear in another form, nor did she step in to substitute roles to maintain visibility. She appeared when necessary, in rare conversations, in moments of measured speech, and then returned to her familiar rhythm. Being present was no longer tied to representation or inspiration, but simply to existing in the right measure, at the right moment. In her 70s, Linda Ronstadt lives within small, clearly defined rhythms. Reading has become a steady habit. Books, memoirs, history, pages that ask nothing of the body in terms of performance tempo. Music is still there, but not through speakers or stages. It exists in memory and imagination. Familiar songs are heard again in the mind at the pitches and tempos they once carried, a private space that requires no confirmation. Daily life is adjusted to the increasingly narrow limits of physical movement. Every action is slower, prepared for, supported. There is no attempt to conceal this, and no intention to turn it into an inspirational narrative. Life is kept simple, sufficient, minimally disrupted, so that presence can continue within the body's real limits. In this state, Linda is no longer in the role of an artist expected to contribute continuously to the public. She lives as someone who has completed her work, holding on to what can still be held: memory, inner music, and a spiritual life that does not need a stage for validation. At the end of that journey, what remains does not appear as a summary ledger. It shows up in small, scattered fragments, often outside the center of the frame. In the memories of those who worked with her, Linda Ronstadt is recalled not first as a great star, but as someone who arrived at the studio on time, learned her material thoroughly, and never treated any genre lightly. When she sang traditional Mexican music, she learned pronunciation line by line as someone returning to a mother tongue. When she stood before Nelson Riddle's orchestra, she accepted lowering her voice, shedding familiar emphases to fit a structure that pre-existed her. When she stepped onto Broadway, she trained as a stage performer in the full sense, without carrying the privileges of outside fame. There are not many quotable lines attributed to Linda. She rarely explained her choices in grand language, but there was a principle she repeated through action. She would not enter a musical space unless she was prepared to follow its rules. That showed younger artists, without formal instruction, a different possibility of the craft. Success does not require appropriation, and a voice does not need to dominate in order to be heard. Within her family, Linda is remembered in a different rhythm, not as someone living in the spotlight, but as someone who kept an everyday discipline, reading widely, remembering deeply, retelling old stories not to impress, but to keep them from being lost. With her children, music was not passed down as a legacy to be born, but as a natural part of shared memory, present, but not imposed. Linda's influence rarely appears as a declaration. It lies in other people's quiet choices. When a young singer decides not to update an old song, when someone accepts stepping back from the center to preserve structure, when an artist chooses silence rather than turning loss into performance. Those choices do not carry her name, but they follow the same logic. Perhaps the clearest mark Linda Ronstadt left is not how far she went, but where she knew to stop. She did not force her voice beyond its limits. She did not force her presence beyond the body's capacity, and she did not extend the story beyond what was necessary. In a culture accustomed to measuring value by constant visibility, that way of existing speaks sufficiently on its own, without naming, without assertion, and without anyone needing to explain it. When the story closes, what lingers is not a final note, but the silence after sound has left the space. Not loud, needing no further confirmation, simply the trace of a life that traveled its full distance, disciplined enough to go far and honest enough to know when to stop. Everyone who has listened to Linda Ronstadt carries a different memory. It may be a song tied to youth, a voice that softened a long evening, or simply the rare feeling of hearing someone sing without having to prove who they were. Those memories are scattered, unordered, undefined, and precisely there is where the story continues to live. If you once paused in the middle of one of her songs, if that voice accompanied you through some stretch of your life, then this journey reached you long before it was told. And perhaps what remains now is simply to listen once more, not to search for glory, but to notice how you have changed since the first time you heard that voice.